Okay, guys, what's my view from the hotel room? All right, so this is part two. So I'm gonna jump around a little bit here, but this is the CVD real study. So this looks at over 1.3 million patients that were on SGLT2. So this is more of a EMR database search kind of study. This wasn't a randomized double-blinded control study. So they just followed patients that was started on SGLT2s and then see what happened to them over the years. And so this is the results. So this was in the Europe and U.S. as well. So this looks at hospitalizations for heart failure. So again, anything on left side of this hazard ratio is positive, and this is the summary here for the total. So essentially, hospitalizations for heart failure, much better for any SGLT2, and majority of these SGLT2 was Farxiga because it was the first one available and it's the most used in Europe. And so this is all-cause death. So it's this was given by a cardiologist, and so he says one of the hardest things is to prevent death, right? So not MI or stroke, but then just death. So again, this was very positive for all SGLT2s. And hospitalizations for heart failure or all-cause death, either one, again, very positive. And so this is the results for Canvas and IMPA-REG. Okay, so not the CVD real. So what about these two studies? Okay, so again, hazard ratios for CV death, non-fatal for the MACE, all of them was better. So CV death again better with IMPA-REG, better than Canvas. And here's the rest of them here. But again, hospitalizations for heart failure better, all cause mortality better, and progression of microalbuminuria, etc. So Cana, this is Invokana, okay, and this is Jardiance. So again, both of them, looks positive. So when you look at the other studies here, looking at it a different way. So this is lixisenatide, and that one was not very good. But Leader, Sustain, and Excel for exenatide. So now we're switching gears to GLP-1 now. So again, all the GLP-1s, it favors GLP-1 for all MACE events. And this is all-cause mortality. Okay. So again, so Sustain is a semaglutide. So semaglutide is a new Novo drug, and again, it's a lot lower volume. So this study wasn't as great as Leader or the exenatide one, the Excel study, as you can see by the numbers, and not very many people, but it was still a little positive for the MACE. All-cause mortality, not so much for Sustain, but Leader and Excel, very positive. And this is another way to look at it. This is another summary of all the GLP-1 trials: Leader, Sustain, Excel, SGLT2, IMPRA, Canvas, CVD Real, okay, pioglitazone. These are the older studies. And then metformin only has one study. And this was UK-PDS, and this only had like 300-400 patients. So very, very poor study. So not much cardiovascular intervention for metformin, okay? So this is another way to look at the Leader trial for liraglutide, semaglutide, and this is the Excel for exenatide. And as you can see, the separation of curves happens here, and then you get a hazard ratio of 0.87, 0.74, and 0.91. So the way to think about this is, hazard ratio 13% for MACE is a 13% improvement, about 25% improvement. Okay, so a lot more than the Leader trial, but again, it's a smaller study, and then about 9% difference here. Okay, so the message here is that GLP-1s is a class effect. Okay, so even though this p-value is 0.06, when you break down the data, the way things are headed, it's a class effect. So no need to get bogged down with these p-values and all this data. Looking at Sustain, hey, this is a smaller trial, blah blah blah, etc. Bottom line is everything is headed in this direction. Okay, so So this is, another way to think about, diabetes, and its complications, right? So you're looking at, macrovascular complications. What causes macrovascular complications in diabetes? So sure, high sugar, smoking, BP. So you have to look at all these things: insulin resistance, age, lipids, obesity, genetics. Okay. For microvascular complications, it's just genetic glucose and blood pressure. Okay. So for macro, it's very, very complicated. Okay. I'm going to go back to the CVD reel. This is the one with DAPA for a second. And this is pretty impressive. And unfortunately, I don't have this part of the slide here. But when you look at the cardiovascular disease, patients with established cardiovascular disease, and again, this was a million patients. This was the study here, the results of this study. They followed these patients over time. And as you can see, these patients that were on SGLT2, mainly DAPA, they did better. Okay, so the relative risk based on what the other patients is about 50%. So 50% reduction in relative risk of heart failure, death, and heart failure or death. Okay, so this is pretty significant. Now over here is patients without established cardiovascular disease. And so these patients, as you can imagine, the number, the bar graphs, it just only went as this high, okay? But, the patients that were on SGLT2, even those patients, there was a 50% reduction, okay? So the relative risk reduction for patients without cardiovascular disease is still 50%, just like patients with cardiovascular disease. So the absolute total number is not very much. The total number of events is much, much lower, but the relative risk is still 50%. And this looks at, so heart failure is very big in cardiology, and this kind of explains it. So this looks at so Kaplan-Meier curve. So this is Kaplan-Meier is looking at survival. So you start here, and then at year 5, you only have about 15% of the patients still alive. So in 5 years, majority of patients with diabetes and heart failure, they're dead. Okay. You look at this and you superimpose, stage 3 lung cancer, is the exact same. Okay. So patients with diabetes and heart failure, their survival is very, very low. So what they're looking at now is they're looking at patients with a heart failure and looking at SGLT2s and see if they can reduce this for these patients and increase their survival. So again, this is diabetes without heart failure. But then again, once you get heart failure, it's like having cancer. Okay. So another way that this is very interesting, we always think when we look at diabetes, we always think of, okay, we got to get the sugars down. What's the A1C? What's the A1C? And so, start thinking about diabetes, in the spectrum of CVD, and so a lot of us do that. And so, we tell patients, hey, you're going to die, not because of DKA or high blood sugars. You're going to die of a heart attack or a stroke. You're going to die of a vascular event. So, so how do we manage blood sugar, in type 2 diabetes? So it's a new paradigm. Instead of managing blood sugar, we look at CVD prevention. Okay. So, you start out over here to the left, CVD risk factors only. So patients only have CVD risk factors. Now they have established cardiovascular disease, or now they have a history of MI stroke, or now they had a recent ACS, recent stroke. Now they got left ventricular dysfunction, and now they got heart failure and end-stage heart failure. So this is the spectrum of CVD, and we need to intervene here to prevent this process. So again, GLP-1s, metformin, play a role here. Metformin here, we're not sure, maybe in in these patients. SGLT2, we have data now and evidence to help at this stage. Pioglitazone, we have data here, and we're still looking at some of these things. So start thinking about diabetes, from CVD perspective. Okay, so and then one last thing, other tidbits on SGLT2s. So SGLT2s in type 1, so the increase in DKA, it's not approved, but if you're gonna use it, use like 2.5 milligrams of DAPA, or use very small amounts of SGLT2. Okay, that's it.